the week beginning Sunday, the 7th of April, and this is the Week Unwrapped at Podcast Live. In the past 7 days, we've seen Brexit talks between the Conservatives and Labour stalling, Prince William touring the security services, and Tiger Roll becoming the first back-to-back winner of the Grand National since Red Rum. But we're here to bring you some of the stories that passed under the radar this week. Big news, not making headlines right now, but with repercussions for all our lives. I'm Olly Mann, and let's unwrap the week. And joining me today from the week's digital team are Rebecca Gillie, Jamie Timson and bossman Holden Frith. Starting the show this week, it's Jamie. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
This was the week that when it came to housing, Euston, we have a problem.
The easiest way I can pull it is being literally put in an island with nothing, because the only thing that is around us is warehouses and business centres. Like, there's not a shop. The closest shop to us is a 40-minute walk. Even commute back to where your family live and things like that, that's what makes you feel isolated as well. You have to walk an hour just before you can even try and travel anywhere else.
There's actually someone standing with a crack pipe, one in their hand, another one's got needles in their hands, and there's blood splattered up the wall. If I'm homeless and they give me this, how can I tell them, no, I don't want that. I'm homeless. How can I then turn something down? But they shouldn't have sold this place to me like a dream. Because to be honest, I would have rather been homeless.
Residents of Terminus House in Harlow speaking to BBC News this week. Jamie, why is a block of flats your story of the week?
Yes, the reason that I've brought this to the table is that this week there was a very interesting report by BBC Look East into Terminus House, and for people who don't know what it is a prime example of a PDR, which is a permitted development rights household or building, basically. And what it means is 5 years ago, the Tory government changed the rules, relaxed the regulations, and said that if you want to, as a property developer, you can change office space into housing without having to go through any of the planning permission or anything that that we have as good guidelines for what housing should be.
Okay, so I understand why you've chosen it, but it isn't special then. There are lots of other examples.
47,000 have been built in the last 3 years, that are similar to that. And in fact,
and then they're not being built, they're conversions.
They're being converted.
So former office blocks that are now people's homes.
The problem stems from, there are lots of problems with them. Basically, one of the big issues is the space of them. For example, there's a group of PDRs that are in Balham, where the average space of the house itself is 18 square metres. Now, just as a comparison, the average Premier Inn room, I love Lenny Henry like anyone does, but it's 21 square metres. So you're talking about beds, kitchen, living area, all within 18 square metres. It's slums. What we've created now is slums, and a race to the bottom in order to build, or not even build, convert office space and put people in them.
Okay, but you can understand, Rebecca, can't you, how the intentions behind this planning law change weren't to create slums. The intention was to make it easier to make housing, which, as we know, is hugely politically problematic.
Yeah, so I think the thing is that these buildings are, they are shocking, and the fact that the guidelines are if you're building a new house, I think the minimum size is something like 37 square metres. The idea that just because you're converting a block of flats into houses, somehow they can be 1/3 the size of a new build is quite shocking. But as you're saying, it's an inevitability of the situation that we're in. And I think even though these office blocks are horrible, the alternative is just that all these people would still be on the waiting list for council housing, or trying to rent privately, which, as we know, is increasingly out of reach of many working people.
And who's to blame for that, Holden? Because I could ask that question to Jamie, but obviously the answer would come back, the Tories, very clearly. But actually, who do you think is really, if you take a step back, to blame for this? Is it the government creating this situation, or is it sort of independent property developers just using a new law?
I think it's a bit of both. The permitted development regulations actually started mostly being applied to individual householders. If you wanted to do a loft conversion, put a small extension at the back, it was meant to reduce bureaucracy on these sort of standardised constructions. And then the thinking behind extending their reach was really to allow more housing to be created in city centres, and that in itself doesn't seem like a bad thing. In a lot of places it's really helped with urban regeneration. But I think where the blame lies is actually it's a combination of private and public. The fact that local councils don't have their own stock of social housing means that they effectively go into the private market, buy up huge numbers of these flats and subrent them to people who then don't have a huge amount of choice about where they're living. So in a situation that might, left to the market, have resolved themselves because people wouldn't want to buy these 18 square metre flats, some of which, the ones in Balham, don't even have windows. But when
I just have to interrupt at that point. Well, I stayed in a hotel room without windows for one night, and I went a bit mental.
Yeah, but apparently
it wasn't a prison cell; it was a hotel room without windows.
There's nothing in the building code that requires windows, but that's because people assumed that no one would ever build a flat without windows, because nobody would ever buy or rent a flat without windows. But when a council is turning to people who have no other choice and little other option, that means that the market forces just aren't really working.
And that's it. So the families that are being located here are amongst the most vulnerable people.
If you take the Terminus house in Harlow as an example, the number of vulnerable people that are being placed in it is incredibly high. And also, so since it was converted, so in 2018, crime in Terminus House itself has gone up 45%, which you might say is inevitable when you turn it into residential blocks. But within the area, it's actually gone up 150%, so around Terminus House. And people are saying that the crime in general, the police, they say that it is connected to the placing of too many people in too small a place. Obviously, there's blame a lot on both sides, to quote Donald Trump, but there is obviously a need and a desire and a real problem with the way that the government chooses to put vulnerable houses. It's a form of social cleansing, like it really is. London boroughs are putting people in Harlow because that their waiting lists are full, and taking people away from their communities, the places that they've grown up, and placing them in areas that are completely unsuitable.
But what's the solution? Because apart from build more houses, which is obviously something that is very easy to sell to the public but very hard to make happen, what should the government do about this now?
Well, first, of course, we need to build more houses. No, but it's not just that, actually. There was an interesting article, an investigation by Sky News, where they found that actually the lack of housing stock, particularly in London and in the southeast, is one problem. But there are also parts of Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland, the north of England, where there are whole streets with only a handful of residents. And there's plenty of housing stock, of good, well-built houses, but nobody to live in them. So I think that you said short term, this is the exact opposite of short term. In the long term, it's going to be about moving towards an economy that's less focused on London and the southeast, because we actually do have really good housing stock in this country. We've got, lovely, Victorian, Edwardian housing stock that's just standing empty in parts of the country as a result of our focus on London and the southeast.
A land value tax is one of the steps towards it. Getting people to pay tax on the value of the land itself, and it will increase. By doing that, you are basically increasing the likelihood that people are going to want to build on that land rather than, as you say, letting it sit empty. There's also a good example in the Netherlands of local authorities who have much more powers than the local authorities in the UK, able to buy land at the kind of current value, not having to pay premium for what will happen when you build on it. I also think there's a kind of just a lack of real kind of positive thinking. A lot of the councils have been stripped, because of austerity primarily, have been stripped of land, like planners, and the ability to oversee the creation of new houses. A lot of really intelligent people are being put off because they can't be hired by local councils.
But the thing about, I keep returning to this, but the thing about a flat with no windows, that seems so obviously a problem, that seems like something that could be regulated against now, because there are rules, aren't there, that landlords have to have gas safety checks every year or whatever it is.
And the permitted development regulations don't actually circumvent building control regulations. So safety standards do have to be adhered to. So one kind of short-term patch would just be to put the size requirement into those sort of basic building control regulations. But I think as long as you have local councils forced to buy up space as cheaply as possible. You're not. There'll always be a way of meeting those requirements in a substandard way, rather than actually putting a bit of pride into those buildings.
Rebecca.
And just on that, that the Balham example is an example of where this is being used, as I think the BBC described it as human warehousing. But there's actually like a kind of weird, glamorous flip side where other former office buildings in London are being turned into, I think the developers call them something like horrible, like micro flats, and they're selling them to young professionals looking to buy their first house. And they're selling this as an advantage. And they're actually, I've read articles covering this before, they're selling these like 18 or 20 metre square flats to young professionals and saying how much the young professionals love it. Because, they don't need that much space, blah, 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 blah.
Well, but actually, isn't that, in a way, that's one of the other problems, is maybe not those, but the ones that are being sold to the ultra-rich, something like Centrepoint, for example. If it's problematic, if it's difficult to make it pay for low-paid people and people on low incomes, then you can see how developers might say, well, let's just turn it into £1 million residences, and it exacerbates the issue.
And that's why you need top-down regulation, right? That's why you need to, at the moment, affordable housing is 80% of the market value, which is nuts in London, like absolutely nuts. And you need, there was a consultation about this very issue in January, and you had ministers saying that actually PDR was a success, and that what we should look into is turning takeaway shops into homes.
But where am I going to get my takeaway from?
We have a government now at the moment who are looking at these issues and saying actually they're working. It's working. At least we, as you say,
at least we're housing people.
At least we're housing people.
It'd be interesting to hear from a generation that have grown up in an office block playing in a playground that used to be a company car park.
Yeah, and even people who are living in their own houses, the average new build in this country now is half the size of some in Europe, like Denmark. And part of that obviously is a function of we just don't have as much space. But I think it's becoming normalised to live in smaller and smaller houses.
Okay, Holden's up next after this. Okay, Holden, your turn. What do you think this week will be remembered for?
This is the week that Democrats called for democracy in America.
Come a general election, presidential candidates don't come to places like Mississippi. Yeah. They also don't come to places like California and Massachusetts, right? Because we're not the battleground states. Well, my view is that every vote matters. And the way we can make that happen is that we can have national voting, and that means get rid of the electoral college and every vote.
Democrat Senator Elizabeth Warren speaking to a slightly larger audience than we have here in Jackson, Mississippi, back in March. So Holden, what happened this week?
Two things. Firstly, we had a senator, Brian Schatz from Hawaii, introducing a amendment to the US Constitution calling for the abolition of the Electoral College. And secondly, New Mexico became the 14th state to sign up for a slightly convoluted plan to abolish the Electoral College without the need for a constitutional amendment.
Now, I know that there are North Americans listening who are on top of all of this detail, but for the benefit of everyone else, remind us, what is the Electoral College and how significant is this they might change the voting system?
It's essentially an invisible second round to the US presidential election. So what we think of as the election, when American citizens vote and we get the results, those results are essentially advisory. And 6 weeks later, there's a second election involving the 538 members of the Electoral College, and that's the one that legally determines who becomes president. It's actually up to each individual state to decide what the link is between the vote in their state and how they nominate electoral voters. But all but two of them do it on a winner-takes-all basis. So if I get one more vote than you, I get all of that state's electoral votes.
Okay, so Elizabeth Warren's campaigning against the current system, but is that just a bit like Ramona's here? Is it a case of, well, Hillary Clinton won the popular vote, didn't become president, so sour grapes, or is there more to it than that?
There's more to it. It has become very partisan, and that's mainly because the last two examples where the Electoral College vote went in the opposite direction from the popular vote were in 2000 when Al Gore got more votes than Bush, but Bush became president, and then, of course, Trump versus Hillary Clinton. But there's no particular reason why it should go that way. And in 2004, if 60,000 people had voted for John Kerry instead of George Bush, he would have come president, even though Bush got 3 million more votes nationwide.
Okay, but Rebecca, they have this electoral college system in the United States because they're a republic, they're a federation of different states. That's the whole point. They're not a democracy in the sense of one person, one vote. So it would be changing fundamentally what America is.
Yeah, so fundamentally the argument goes that if they did not have an electoral college, then the candidates would just concentrate on big cities, which obviously in the modern era have tended to vote Democratic, and that they would neglect the smaller, more sparsely populated states. This wasn't actually what the framers of the Constitution intended at all, because there were no big cities in those days, and there were also no political parties. Their point was more rooted in the idea the average person wouldn't be able to make an educated vote, because there weren't really nationally prominent figures like there are now. Obviously, the world was a lot smaller to the average person. But the argument that the people who are backing this national popular vote, they're saying that actually, in reality, what happens is the smaller states aren't neglected. It's the set red and blue states that are neglected. And they drew. I mean, I can't describe it with words, but there was a map where they showed the distribution of political rallies, and they found that almost all of them happened in battleground states like Ohio, Virginia, and basically states like Mississippi, as Elizabeth Warren was saying, and Wyoming. States that are traditionally vote red or blue every election. But get no attention. Wouldn't
you make the new battleground states the cities then, the coasts, and you completely ignore the flyover states? You just have the problem in reverse.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it's not a huge surprise that I think the answer is to go proportionally. So actually divide up the electoral college votes of the state by the percentage of the vote itself.
Which they do at the moment in Maine and Nevada, I think.
Nebraska.
Yeah. Because, for instance, Obama won 40% of the vote in Alabama, and yet John McCain got 60% of it, and that then meant that John McCain got all of the votes. And whereas it would give some element of fairness to say that maybe 40% of the electoral college votes should go to Obama in that situation. And I think probably then you are getting people across the country more engaged. You've got someone in Alabama that's more likely to go out and vote because they think their vote actually means something.
Well, and another problem with the current system is the way that the number of electors is decided is that it's the number of senators, so each state has 2 senators, so every state starts off with 2 electors minimum, plus the number of representatives in the House of Representatives. Now, much like MPs here, that's decided, each state is divided into districts to represent a certain amount of people. The problem is that new representatives are hardly ever added. So the districts in places like Los Angeles, New York, etc., keep having more and more people in them whose votes aren't being represented by as many individual representatives, which means that their total number of electors is smaller proportionally than the... am I just confusing you?
I mean...
So put it this way. Montana has 3 electoral votes.
You're describing an infographic again, aren't you?
Yes, I am. California has something like 55. California has many, many, many times more the population of Montana. But it means that a vote in Montana is worth something like 3 times more than a vote in California.
But, Holden, is it just the Democrats that are animated by this, to put that question to you again? Really?
At the moment it is, and all of the states that have signed up to this sort of amendment by the back door have been Democratic.
And how many states have signed up?
14. They're about 2/3 of I should explain how this works, which is again going to be a very painful and mind-melting experience. But
there's one thing we like about our podcast. Pain is right up there with the crucial brand values of the Week Unwrapped.
The pain starts with the name of it, which is the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact.
Right.
And what it is that the states that sign up pledge to pass legislation that they will award their electoral votes according to the outcome of the national popular vote, regardless of who votes for whom in their state. So,
but then that is less democratic, isn't it?
No,
because Jamie said when you tally up the proportion of people in that state, not the national.
It only applies once a total of states which account for at least half of the electoral college votes have committed to it. So at that point, it will actually become a national popular vote, because even if all of the other states had gone, say, for the Republicans, and the national popular vote was 50% plus 1 for Democrats, those states would be able to
It's not going to
shovel
happen.
there.
It's not going to happen. There you
Well,
are.
it's more likely to happen than the constitutional amendment because they're already 2/3 of the way towards the target, towards that 50% target.
And if they reach 50%, then it happens.
If they reach 50%, they're all bound to. And it's effectively exploiting the very problem with the Electoral College, which is that there's no mandated link between the vote in a state and how those votes are elected. It's just trying to jerry-rig a national popular vote out of the existing system.
So it might happen. but I mean, I think that the idea of it isn't going to happen for the same reason that proportional representation doesn't exist. Oh, we didn't change our vote. We have never changed our voting system in the UK.
Well, that's an interesting example, isn't it? Because what was the reason we didn't change the system back here? I think it was because it became needlessly complicated and became an AV vote, and that was the fudge in the coalition government.
Tories lied to the Lib Dems. Lib Dems said, don't back. Whatever you do, we're going to do this referendum. Can you please not put the government backing to one side or the other? And the Tories said, yeah, of course, we're not going to do that. And then they went and backed no to AV.
But the public didn't understand what AV meant.
No, absolutely, no. But then the thing is...
And the American public wouldn't understand what Holden just told me, because I don't understand
I think it would be a hard sell in Republican states, because whether it's true or not, there is a perception that red, sparsely populated states are given more prominence under the current system that they would lose if the national popular vote was the decider.
And that was actually, at least in part, the reason that the Electoral College was introduced in the first place. It was meant to ensure that slaveholding states weren't outvoted by free states in the north, because the number of electoral voters was determined by the total number of white population and then 3/5 of the slave population. And so it effectively meant that a white vote in the south was worth 1/3 more than a white vote in the north. And the more slaves a state had, the bigger its voice in the
Thank you for just
election.
contextualizing this in a way that made me suddenly think, oh, this is important.
This has just reminded me that this debate now also has a racial component. I wish I could remember his name now, but they interviewed the former governor of Maine, asking him what he thought about this plan. And he said that if this plan happens, white people will not be deciding the vote anymore. It will be decided by Hispanic people, black people, i.e. there are the smaller, sparser, more overrepresented states are majority white, and the states who at the moment have their voting influence limited are more the coastal cities which have a higher non-white population. So there is an unspoken, or in the case of this guy, spoken, fear that white people's disproportionate influence will be reduced.
The shifting demographics could actually lead to a situation where it was more likely to happen because the proportion of Hispanic voters in Florida, Texas, Arizona is increasing. The Republican lock on the Electoral College may actually start to weaken, and that could, if you get to a situation where more pro-Democrat states have signed up to this pact already, and then the pendulum seems to be shifting so that the Electoral College is actually now in favour of the Democrats, that could bring in the Republican states behind them, and you end up with creating this slightly ramshackle approach, and then the pressure to actually do a proper constitutional amendment through the Senate would increase.
Okay, you are listening to The Week Unwrapped from Podcast Live. It is a podcasting festival and focusing on politics, which is why we've done 2 stories about politics. We're going to do a story about podcasting. Rebecca, after this. And so finally this week, it's Rebecca. What do you think this week will be remembered for?
When it comes to true crime, the question isn't who done it, but who's listening to it.
Thank you for sharing that.
And it means a lot to us to know that somebody who is so close to the grief and pain of a victim would listen to our podcast, because that means we only want to do right. We know that comedy can be very irreverent and inappropriate sometimes when we're talking about victims, but we never want anyone to feel like that's what we're laughing at. We're just laughing about talking to each other. So it means a lot to us that you listen to our podcast. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
That was a recent live edition of the apparently very popular true crime podcast, My Favourite Murder, by Karen Kilgariff and Georgia Hardstark. I can't imagine how you do a true crime podcast live? Did someone commit a crime and then they unpick it during the discussion?
No, I actually went to see them in London, and they did Jack the Ripper, and then about halfway through, the presenter was like, "Oh, and this is the bit where he eviscerated her." And then everyone was sort of laughing nervously. No, it is a very popular podcast. It gets 19 million downloads per month.
Yeah, all right.
Sorry, much like ours.
Yeah.
So what I wanted to talk about this week was that there were 2 articles, one in the BBC and one in the Guardian, suggesting that our obsession with true crime has become problematic, the P word.
Okay, well, actually, since we're in a room of podcast listeners, who here, by a show of hands, listens to a true crime podcast of some sort or of another? About 40%, I'd say, unscientifically there. So, okay, very popular genre. What is the fascination with true crime in podcast form, and what does it tell us?
Well, so, okay, if you go back to, like, true crime has always been popular, but I think if you went back to before the emergence of Serial in 2014, that was probably the one that started it off, this new wave of interest. You know, the people who were associated with being into true crime were either people watching your kind of trashy Wives with Knives, Women Who Kill, Forensic Files. You know,
those titles came a little too readily to
I
me.
know. What you would, aim very much at daytime TV viewers, and then the weirdos, the people at home with compendiums of serial killers, or murmuring things about Ted Bundy. And cut to 2019, and everyone is into true crime. And I think it started off with Serial, but now you did mention that this is a political event, and there is a political connection, I think. 2014, when Serial came out, was also a massive year for feminism. It was the year of the Yes All Women hashtag, which is kind of the forerunner of the Me Too one, which was in response to the Isla Vista shootings. When Elliot Rodger wrote an anti-women manifesto and then went to gun down women at a sorority house. And so I think they really emerged in tandem. The other thing that I thought was really interesting
what? It's a big year for feminism and true crime podcasts.
Well, we listened to My Favourite Murder then.
Make the dubious connection you're implying.
Get ready, because here it comes.
Oh, sorry.
A few weeks after Making a Murderer came out on Netflix, was the first episode of My Favourite Murder. It's continued to roll since then, and it's only gotten more popular, and I think there is a link to this in the fact that the vast majority of the people who are listening to true crime podcasts and consuming documentaries on Netflix like Making a Murderer are women. Women have always been the primary consumers of true crime, but now we're specifically seeing young women. And I don't think it's coincidence that that demographic is the one that also overlaps with the people who are most likely to be victims of the kinds of crime you typically read
She's
about.
made it. She's made the connection. Okay.
Like, I was just about to go into sexual violence, but there was a smile still on my face, so I'll start again.
Yeah.
Such sexual violence, stalking, being the victim of a serial killer, even though men are statistically more likely to be murdered, women are more likely to be murdered in these kind of typical true crime scenarios.
So are you saying that, you're a young woman, so you can answer this personally. Is there an element
Appreciate that.
Well, is there an element of identification or almost like relief that those topics are being discussed?
Yeah, well, actually, Amanda Vickery, who's an American social psychologist who studied popularity of true crime, has found the number one reason people listen to it the number one reason that women listen to it, watch it, etc., is that they want to learn how to not be in that situation. They're basically picking up survival tips. But I think what I have noticed, as I'm pretty into true crime,
as you can tell,
what you've really come to see is a kind of gentler, nicer true crime, if you will, that's very aware of the way in the past true crime has been very 2 men talking over a naked woman's battered body on an autopsy table. And so the newer true crime, if you look at the ones that have been popular recently, you've got Making a Murderer, which was about an underprivileged family who were basically railroaded by police. The Keepers, which was about the murder of a nun, possibly orchestrated by the Catholic Church. And the pattern you can see in all of these is that it's about shining light on victims from these underprivileged communities or marginalised in some other way, whether they're women or from a racial minority. And the villains are institutions. It's not like in Forensic Files where, the police charge in and arrest the bad guy. The bad guys are the police, organised religion, basically authority, and I think that reflects something that we've seen in the wider culture as well.
But, Jamie, there's still a portion of the audience that are watching mostly women getting battered and murdered and dissected for entertainment. I mean, at the end of the day, whether that audience is female or not, part of the reason those shows are compelling is they are entertaining.
Yeah, and I think what Rebecca is, the infographic that Rebecca was describing just then, I think what's key about it is that it's a much more discerning now. I think the proportion of people that are watching it for that reason, you know, you only have to look at the things that are really popular on TV, even away from true crime, you know, things like Fleabag and stuff deal with issues with sensitivity, and I think that's the point that you're making, isn't it? That actually these true crimes, these newer true crime things are actually less about looking at dead bodies over a morgue and making wisecracks, and actually more about, you know, what are the issues here? What are the wider implications? That kind of thing.
Okay, regular listeners to the show will know that at the point we've just heard the millennial view, I always turn to Holden for a glimpse into classical history. Holden, Jack the Ripper, that's been a story that's fascinated people for a long time. People have always liked the Penny Dreadfuls, the murder mysteries. Yeah. Aren't these two, with it millennials, just telling us that there's some woke reason to be interested in this stuff when actually people just like grisly murders and always have?
I think so, but I think there's...
I think so.
But I think there's an even more direct connection, actually, between the sort of resurgence of this genre with podcasting and with those Penny Dreadfuls. Those were serial tales of ghoulish killings told week by week, drawing their audience on with twists and cliffhangers. And I think, you know, the podcast that's often credited with bringing this back is Serial. And I think there was you know, quite a... I
love the fact that we're talking about true crime as a siren goes past the window.
But yeah, I think there has always been a fascination with murder, and always a slight discomfort with that fascination. And George Orwell wrote an essay in 1946 called The Decline of the English Murder, in which he was satirizing the tendency of comfortable middle classes to kind of settle down in the armchair by the fire after a Sunday roast and reach for the news of the world to read the details of the recent gruesome murder.
And that is kind of what you're relating to, isn't it, Rebecca, when you sit and watch those things? I think the idea that young women in particular relax by watching this content or listening to this content is the thing that feels really discordant, isn't it?
Yeah, but I think there is definitely a kind of, there's an empowering element to it, that by focusing on the victims more as people, I think that it just enables, you know, it's kind of a vicarious thrill, if you will. You know, you're picturing yourself in that scenario, what would you do, etc., rather than focusing on women as just kind of passive victims of violence. But I do actually think that the criticism this week about whether our love of true crime is problematic, there is actually something to be said for that, because what we're seeing now is, you know, this is actually, the recent resurgence of true crime has kind of been a grassroots movement. A lot of the most popular podcasts have just been started by a couple of friends sitting in a bedroom, etc. And now, as ever, we're seeing Jamie's top bugbear, the forces of capitalism.
Yes.
Descending.
Other one.
Really descending on it. They've seen that there's this huge audience who are possibly always there, but are now more visible, kind of respectable, if you will, mainstream consumers of true crime. They're trying to capitalize on it, and you can see that they're not always getting it right. Netflix had a huge misfire recently with their Ted Bundy documentary, which was really pitched as this is going to be the new Making a Murderer, this is going to be the new, you know, The Keepers Abducted in Plain Sight, etc.
This is starring Zac Efron as Ted Bundy,
No, that's the film.
Okay.
That's problematic too, but we probably don't have time for that.
Fine.
It was literally just tapes of Ted Bundy himself talking, and that Netflix really thought they were onto a winner with this, and it just met with a huge backlash because it was completely tone deaf to what this new audience wants.
Should the victims be consulted more? Because that's it. Like, I was thinking about this watching, I don't know if you saw the case against Adnan Syed, which is the Sky Atlantic documentary about the serial murders that was running this week. And again, the family of Olly Mann, who's the girl who was murdered at the centre of all this by someone, possibly Adnan Syed, had not cooperated.
It was Adnan.
Jamie says it was. Had not cooperated with the programme. They hadn't cooperated with Serial. They hadn't cooperated with this. At what point do you say, I'm going to stop making, however illuminating they are and however much we treat the victim as the victim, if the victim's family don't want you to make the programme, you're being tone deaf, aren't you?
There was a similar backlash to Netflix to the Madeleine McCann documentary because the family didn't want to participate
and
in
the
that.
Jamie Bulger short film as well.
Yeah, exactly. So I think those are getting pushed back against precisely because they're not really respectful of the way that this resurgence in popularity has come about. It's come about because people want to see a more empathetic, a more empowering of the victim's narrative instead of these old ones. Bauer Media just announced that there's going to be a new magazine, I think it's called Crime Monthly or something, again trying to capitalise on this same audience. But if you looked at the front cover, the headline was literally Millie Dowler, Fresh Agony for Family. It's taking this very old-fashioned, kind of trashy tabloid approach, and I think that those are definite examples of the way that this popularity is being misinterpreted by some publishers.
Jamie?
There was a theory that was saying that actually the reason that women are more interested in true crime as an example is actually to do with whether or not they have an outlet for types of aggression or things like that. Men do have more outlets for that, and whether they can. These are the types of true crime podcasts are the types of things where you can put yourself in a different situation, and actually women don't have that many outlets for that aspect of things. I'm not saying I agree with it entirely.
I think there's some truth to that, but I think the main thing is that...
So the idea would be listening to Serial is the female equivalent of playing Call of Duty?
Well, yes, I think there's definitely an element. There's always going to be a subset of people who are going to get some kind of, a dark thrill, if you will, from this genre. But I think for the majority of people consuming it, it's about the interactivity makes you less afraid. There's so much we hear now about women speaking out about about harassment, violence, abuse, etc. And I think there is an atmosphere of fear as a kind of negative impact of that as well, is that women are maybe a bit more fearful. I think the interactivity really cuts through the fear. If you're laughing along with a comedy murder podcast, which is a thing that can exist in our time, then you're not as afraid that something will happen to you. Or if you're listening to Serial and trying to figure out who did it, the interactivity makes you feel empowered rather than like you're going to be a passive victim.
I think that seems to be a common feature of a lot of them as well, is that sense of building a community who listen in private but then will come together online and try to play an active part in solving a mystery, which is a very human thing to want to do.
That's actually another link that this has with the recent wave of feminism. A lot of people are saying that the characteristic of fourth wave feminism, which has kind of developed over the past few years, is that most of it takes place online, and that's exactly the same thing that we see with true crime, as it builds these online communities.
Okay, I'm going to finish by asking you to recommend some true crime stuff.
Can I start?
Yeah, well, you can start and finish because you're only going to... Well, actually, no, you can't start because I don't even know if Holden and Jamie listen to this stuff at all. Do you?
I listen to some of it, but I'm obviously not in any way as much of a fan as Rebecca.
Fine. You don't have
but
to be.
I actually think it's interesting because I find things like Last Podcast on the Left, and My Favourite Murder, actually not interesting enough for me. There are things that I find more interesting than true crime. As for an example of one of the ones I did really like, if anyone has not seen The Imposter, which is a film and kind of documentary, it's a real watch.
Well, someone needs to do a podcast about crime stats in Harlow, and then obviously you'll be fully on board.
Yes.
Holden?
I guess this is a sub-genre of true crime, but I've been listening to the RFK tapes recently, which is sort of delving through the possible conspiracy theories about the assassination of Robert Kennedy.
Yeah.
And what's really interesting is it's presented by two people, and they start off with fairly similar theories about what happened, and they end up in very, very different places.
Go on, Rebecca.
Go on. I'm just bursting.
Give us a top two.
Top two? That's very generous. I think my favourite one that I've seen in recent years is there's a documentary series called The Jinx, possibly the only true crime documentary designed to implicate a participating subject. It's basically just watching a rich, weird guy talking himself into being implicated in committing 3 murders. And it has a fantastic twist at the end. And I really enjoyed Abducted in Plain Sight, which has a trashy title, and you really think it's going to be a rubbish, really exploitative documentary. But it's actually the craziest story you'll ever hear, and it's all about organised religion and how it has, just how it allows things to be covered up, etc.
Okay, well, we'll bring you some gory murders on next week's show, but that is it from this edition. My thanks to Holden Frith, Rebecca Gillie and Jamie Timson. And all our gruesome pasts are unwrapped week by week in our archive of past shows, which you can discover like a true crime podcast and investigate on your own behalf when you subscribe to The Week Unwrapped on your podcast app of choice. I've been Olly Mann. I'm innocent. Our music is by Tom Morby. Thank you to Podcast Live for hosting us. The producer was Matt Hill at Rethink Audio, who's been sitting here in the front row and waiting for me to say until we meet again to unwrap next week. Bye!